Hello everyone, tonight we start with the pantheon of ancient Greek gods, a powerful, dramatic and emotionally disturbed pantheon that is wonderfully dysfunctional. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Let's start with the big guy himself, Zeus, the sky god, the lord of Olympus, and a living example of how losing your sense of boundaries is utterly devastating. Cronus and Rhea's youngest son was Zeus. In order to keep his kids from overthrowing him, his father, like many great fathers, had a tendency to swallow them whole. Romantic. The fact that Rhea was able to preserve newborn Zeus by deceiving Cronus with a boulder wrapped in a blanket speaks volumes about how attentive this man was. Freud would have a field day when Zeus grew up and led a divine rebellion against Cronus, released his siblings Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter, and cut open his father's tummy. Boom. It was the beginning of the first dysfunctional family. Zeus ascended to the throne after the gods defeated the Titans. He was in charge of cosmic order, justice, and vows. He dominated the heavens and commanded lightning and thunder. That is, in theory. Zeus actually spent most of his time changing into different animals and wooing anything that had a heartbeat. Bulls, eagles, golden mist, and swans. The man lacked a sense of calm and a steady moral compass. Imagine the justice of your nation's highest court becoming a goose to attract the public. Zeus with more lightning, that is. His romantic life was a public catastrophe. His marriage to his sister, Hera, went about as smoothly as one could anticipate. He had scores of affairs with mortals, nymphs, goddesses, and perhaps a houseplant or two. The outcome? Numerous demigod children unintentionally created entire mythology, and many of them suffered from severe parental desertion. Nevertheless, Zeus wasn't totally disorderly. He served as the cosmic referee when he wasn't cheating or throwing lightning bolts at mortals who failed to make appropriate offerings. To be honest, it took work to enforce vows, enforce the law, and sometimes punish others who were more conceited than he was. Zeus was revered, dreaded, and a continual source of Olympus's public relations problems. He was powerful, imposing, and completely insensitive to others' personal space. He was the ultimate divine contradiction, a judgment and a joke, a predator and a defender. Ironically, Hera's own marriage is a complete dumpster fire on a golden chariot, despite the fact that she is officially the goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth. Because of mythology, she is both Zeus's sister and wife. The divine ideal of a sacred marriage was intended to be their wedding. Rather, it became a centuries-long soap opera about adultery, retaliation, and the startling number of individuals who were transformed into animals, trees, or stones. Despite being the unchallenged queen of the gods, Hera's power mostly manifests itself in one very particular way: retribution. Naturally not on Zeus, that would be too easy, no. Hera's rage is directed specifically at the women Zeus woos or, let's face it, abducts, and their poor offspring. In one especially brutal instance, she attempted to murder newborn Hercules with a pair of serpents, cursed another to talk only in echoes, and transformed a woman into a cow. He literally had that baby. Hers? No. His? Nope. Still, it's difficult to fully blame her. While your husband is out there creating new kinds of animal-based flirtation, see yourself as the goddess of marriage. Nevertheless, she frequently used complex punishments and eternal curses as divine coping techniques. In ancient Greece, retaliation considered the best course of action because therapy was non-existent. Nevertheless, Hera was more than just a celestial resentment. In addition, she punished mortals for breaking oaths, safeguarded women during childbirth, and theoretically maintained the integrity of marriage. She had a loyal cult following, temples and priests. She was revered as a powerful force of heavenly order in cities like Argos and Samos. To put it briefly, Hera was the goddess you invoked in times of faithfulness, and the one who most likely sent a plague in times of unfaithfulness. As the personification of female strength and dignity in a society that continuously degraded her, she is an intriguing paradox. There is more to her narrative than jealousy. It concerns a lady who, by keeping Olympus together with only spiteful and ornamental rage, was meant to represent unification. Poseidon was the deity of storms, earthquakes, the sea, and, strangely enough, horses, because a herd of stallions galloping is the epitome of ocean god. Hey, mythology. Among the three primary brothers was him. Hades received the underworld, Poseidon received the sky, and Zeus received everything was damp, which was perfect for him. He controlled both beautiful and terrifying sea creatures, presided over the wide waters, and carried a huge trident, not just a sharp fork, but a three-pronged divine rage stick that could level entire cities. Poseidon was equally feared and revered. Fishermen offered sacrifices, sailors prayed to him for safe passage, and city builders sought his approval before constructing anything too near the shoreline for fear that it might unintentionally become beachfront property. Let's face it, though, Poseidon had problems. Large, tidal wave-sized, crashing emotional problems. He was the quintessential erratic uncle, always a little salty, sometimes giving, sometimes damaging. He's making islands 1 minute. He's flooding your fields the next day because someone at a sacrificial goat ceremony failed to give him credit. At one point, he hit the ground with his trident so forcefully that it sparked an earthquake, only because Athena defeated him in a contest to name the city. Really? She presented an olive tree to Athens. He proposed a spring with salt water. People decided on olives. He decided on revenge. That's the essence of Poseidon. His romantic life was likewise pretty convoluted. There were nymphs, mortals, and even an instance where Medusa was branded a monster and given snake hair. Yet he left without repercussions. Traditional. Nevertheless, Poseidon was more than a storm tornado. In his more serene periods, he was a fertility and prosperity deity, a city builder, and a guardian of sailors. For a society so reliant on the sea, he was vital to ancient Greek life. However, he was always one storm away from reminding everyone who was in charge, much like the ocean itself. The god of the underworld is Hades. It's a big dark place where all souls finally clock out for eternity, not exactly hell. In contrast to contemporary popular culture, Hades was not a bad person. Not that he was especially mean, he was simply so sick of everyone. Hades drew the short straw and was forced to handle the ancient Greek equivalent of customer service for the dead, while Zeus received the sky and Poseidon received the seas, forever in the dark. There was crying all around. Hades had a silent, sulky power over the underworld. He wasn't ostentatious, he was not noisy, he never crashed weddings or threw lightning. Managing the logistics of eternity and ensuring that souls didn't sneak out the back, he just came up for work every day. The best middle manager. Since naming a kingdom for oneself was reportedly not a warning sign in those days, his territory was also named Hades, the glorious Elysium, the mediocre Asphodel, and the genuinely terrible Tartarus, ancient Greece's equivalent of an extremely lengthy imprisonment, were all represented in its portions. And who was responsible for supervising it all? Yes, exactly, the god's goth workaholic, Hades. Let's go on to Persephone. He did indeed kidnap her. Not very good, undoubtedly troublesome. Additionally, and Greek mythology is nothing if not contradictory, they developed into a marriage that was both functional and oddly steady. She brought life to the underworld with him half the year and caused spring on earth the other half. The timeshare is more legendary than romantic. The original pet father was Hades as well. Cerberus, his dog, was unruly, irritable, and had no obedience training. He did, however, keep souls in line, for the most part. Hades didn't cheat, he didn't get angry, and he didn't want attention as his brothers did. That's presumably why temples were rarely constructed for him by the ancient Greeks. They were afraid of drawing his notice. He was the silent, gloomy uncle you kept at a safe, civil distance, but didn't ask to the celebration. The goddess of knowledge, battle strategy, handicrafts, and effortlessly staying 10 steps ahead of everyone is Athena. In a world full of lightning bolt-wielding emotional wrecks, she is essentially the heavenly incarnation of reason. Freud would have nightmares over her birth alone. Zeus naturally experienced a searing headache after swallowing her pregnant mother Metis due to prophecy. He took a hammer to the skull instead of aspirin, and Athena emerged fully grown, fully armored, and completely unimpressed with everyone. Athena made it apparent right on that she wasn't here for frivolity. In contrast to her war-loving brother Ares, Athena saw battle as a chessboard that could be controlled, analyzed, and won. Maximum efficiency with minimal screaming. Athena was a spreadsheet-filled war room, if Ares was a wild bar fight. She is also the goddess of crafts, which may sound strange until you realize how dangerous weaving was for her. Ask the mortal who dared to challenge Athena to a weaving competition, Arachne. Technically, Arachne prevailed, but because she was a bit too gifted, she was later transformed into a spider. Be modest or enjoy your new life in the corner of someone's ceiling. That's the lesson here. Athena avoided romance at any costs. She didn't marry her brother, seduce mortals, or change into dubious creatures like the rest of Olympus did. She just had things to do, owls to nurture, heroes to counsel, cities to defend. She helped Perseus decapitate Medusa, led Odysseus home, and most likely used a red pen to edit the Iliad. You would want the goddess Athena to lead your startup, serve on your debate team, or serve on your war council. She just outsmarts everyone, every time, without screaming or plotting. The Greek god of battle, Ares, was known for his carnage and his first punch, never mentality. Ares was war with a sledgehammer and a lack of self-control, whereas Athena was war with a blueprint. He stood for the ruthless, unadulterated chaos of combat, when yelling men rushed into one another and nobody really understood what was going on other than that everything was burning and someone had just lost a helmet. To put it briefly, if Ares appears, chaos, violence, and loudness are on the horizon. He wasn't exactly Olympus's favorite visitor in terms of personality. He was disliked even by his fellow gods. He was allegedly referred to by Zeus as the most hostile of all the gods, and when Zeus calls you a problem, you know you've messed up. Ares was conceited, impulsive, and as unassuming as a burning chariot. Nor was he regarded with much respect. Ares constantly failed to bring strategy, temperance, and cunning to the table, qualities that the Greeks valued. He just came in swinging. He didn't use strategies to win wars. That sometimes succeeded, but more often than not it left a path of dead bodies and irritated allies in its wake. Even yet, Ares remained a terrible presence. He was literally the god of fear. He loved being in the middle of a fight, and his kids were named Phobos and Deimos, or Panic and Terror. Additionally, he had an affair with Aphrodite, which sounds lovely, until you consider that it ended with her husband Hephaestus entangling him in an invisible web and the entire pantheon laughing at him. The tabloids of ancient Greece had a field day. In Roman mythology, Ares was transformed into Mars, who was less sweating, more disciplined, and more honorable. However, he remained the tumultuous, muscular figure of violence in Greece. Ares did, however, have his moments. He was both feared and revered during actual wartime. In the hopes that he might give them strength or at least ignore them for a while, warriors offered sacrifices to him. He also gets at least one style point for riding a cool chariot drawn by fire-breathing horses when he wasn't smashing stuff. The goddess of beauty, desire, love, and passionate messes with a lot of bodies was called Aphrodite. Congratulations! You have experienced the divine power of Aphrodite if you have ever observed someone fall in love too quickly with the wrong person. Depending on your tolerance for trauma, there are two Genesis stories for her. She is Zeus and Dion's daughter. In one version, she was created from the sea foam that resulted from Cronus chopping off Uranus's heavenly equipment and throwing it into the sea. In the older, and to be honest, more stranger version, indeed it's likely the least romantic origin the goddess of romance has ever been given. In the presence of Aphrodite, both gods and mortals essentially lost their capacity for wise decision-making due to her breathtaking beauty. She was attracted to everyone because of her true magical belt, the cestus. It is, let's face it, a slightly unfair advantage when it comes to love. Even though Aphrodite was the epitome of desire, her personal romantic life was complex. Her famed preference for the company of Ares, the god of battle, speaks much about her taste in men. She was married to Hephaestus, the hard-working deity of fire and blacksmithing. When Hephaestus caught them in the middle of their love affair in a golden net and called the other gods to come and examine it, their affair was revealed. Retaliation and collective humiliation were seen as excellent conflict resolution techniques in ancient Greece. Aphrodite, however, wasn't all mayhem and infidelity. She also had a tender side. She offered beauty to the world, assisted young loves, and officiated marriages. Before declaring a crush or attempting to charm their way out of a foolish situation, folks would pray to her. She wasn't beyond initiating battles, though. The Trojan War began when she proposed Helen of Troy to Paris. Why? Because she was hoping to win a contest for divine beauty? Indeed, it is. Aphrodite's desire for a golden fruit that spoke to the loveliest caused a whole civilization to burn. She is not the patroness of stability, but of desire. Gorgeous, enticing, and completely unconcerned with the limits of your relationship. The deity of fire, metalworking, craftsmanship, and the only Olympian with a real profession was Hephaestus. Hephaestus was in the workshop, manufacturing weapons, constructing palaces, and grumbling to himself, while the other gods were busy launching wars, pursuing mortals, or hurling lightning like confetti. There are differences in his origin narrative, but none of them are positive. According to one story, he is born malformed, and Hera throws him off Mount Olympus like unwanted baggage because she finds his appearance repulsive. In another, following a family dispute, Zeus throws the ball. The man, in any case, lands hard after falling from heaven, leaving him with a permanent limp and perhaps some abandonment issues the size of Crete. Hephaestus returns to Olympus in spite of the difficult beginning. It's via leverage, not forgiveness. To Hera's surprise, he creates a magical golden throne that traps her. The gods implore him to come back and set her free. He consents, but only if he is allowed to rejoin the Holy Club. The negotiation was excellent. Hephaestus returns to Olympus and assumes the role of the divine handyman. He creates almost every supernatural object that people boast about, including Achilles' armor, Poseidon's trident, and Zeus's thunderbolts. It most likely made it while putting in unpaid overtime if it glows, flies, or explodes. Despite his genius, he was often treated with contempt. Famously, his wife, Aphrodite, who was assigned rather than chosen, cheated on him with Ares. To be kind, his family is emotionally aloof. The things that he recently fixed are being broken by his co-workers. However, Hephaestus never plotted like Hera or struck out like Ares. His retaliation was inventive, sophisticated, and even passive-aggressive. That net he caught Ares and Aphrodite in the middle of their affair? Artisan-made and made to cause the most public embarrassment possible, both poetic and useful. He isn't glitzy or glittering, yet he is the god who actually constructed Olympus. The god's working-class deity, Hephaestus, is the unsung hero, the patron of inventors, blacksmiths, craftspeople, and anybody else who has ever yelled at a broken machine and then used duct tape and fury to fix it. The deity of travelers, trade, robbers, messaging, and strangely rapid-fire speech is Hermes. He's the guy with the winged sandals, the staff that most likely didn't have a user manual, and the energy that shouts, "I've already lied twice today and eaten 3 olives." Hermes, in contrast to other gods, got right into things. He stole Apollo's cattle, made the lyre out of a tortoise shell, crept out of his crib on the day of his birth, and then before anybody could notice, he went back to his cradle. That's the first day. It takes most gods millennia to wreak that kind of havoc. It took Hermes almost 6 hours. He is referred to as the god's messenger, but that is an understatement. In addition to delivering communications, he led heroes across hostile area, smuggled souls into the underworld, and most likely created the celestial equivalent of quick shipping. With a dazzling smile and a strangely evasive alibi, Hermes was already 2 steps ahead of any trouble. Because the same person who supervises theft is the epitome of trustworthy marketplace energy, he also functioned as the deity of trade and business. Hermes stood for compromise, persuasion, and ethically adaptable business practices. In essence, she is the patroness of pickpockets, salespeople, tourists, and anyone who has ever bartered at a flea market. He was more than simply a charming outlaw, though. When it mattered, Hermes was devoted. He assisted Odysseus in outwitting Circe. He supplied Perseus the implements he needed to decapitate Medusa. Beneath all that hilarity, he had a job he took seriously, as seen by the astonishing tenderness with which he guided souls to the underworld. The caduceus, a winged staff with 2 interwoven snakes, was another of Hermes's trademark accessories. Ironically, given that Hermes's main skills were speed, deceit, and professional boundary hopping, it is frequently mistaken for the emblem of medicine. Hermes would be the over-caffeinated tech man who uses acronyms to cure your problems in 2 minutes and then vanishes to optimize cloud functions, which might or might not include taking Zeus's wallet if Olympus had an IT department. He's witty, nimble, unpredictable, and incredibly endearing. The deity of finishing tasks, getting away with it, and ignoring follow-up inquiries. Demeter is the goddess of agriculture, harvest, grain, and, when she feels like it, giving birth to life. Trees give fruit, crops grow, and the earth is abundant when Demeter is pleased. Well, welcome to famine, winter, and overall withering disappointment when she's upset. She is one of the more subdued Olympians. She doesn't launch thunderbolts, initiate conflicts, or transform humans into animals, but don't assume that silence equates to innocuousness. It turns out that she had the ability to shut down the planet's food supply with only one bad mood. Here comes Persephone, her adored daughter, and Olympus's actual flower child. Hades, the underworld's god, and a skilled kidnapper, swoops in and kidnaps Persephone one day while she is out collecting flowers, going about her usual legendary business. Greek parenting problem in the classic sense. Naturally, Demeter loses her divine mind. Grieving, she looks everywhere but won't allow anything to grow until her daughter is back. Animals go hungry, crops fail, and mortals plead for forgiveness. What did Demeter say? No produce, no Persephone. Zeus finally steps in, primarily because no one is offering any sacrifices and the humans are dying. An agreement is made. The seasons are created because Persephone will spend some of the year with Hades and some with Demeter. Summer and spring. Demeter is content. Winter and fall. She's sulking. Indeed, Demeter's yearly mood swings are one of the most significant natural cycles in human existence. Emotional blackmail and maternal mourning drive global agribusiness, the best mythology. Demeter was a great believer in justice as well. When the parents interrupted her in the middle of her ceremony, she once burned a royal baby after teaching people how to cultivate wheat and create civilizations. Although she straddles the boundary between being a fearsome earth witch and a goddess of life, Demeter is fundamentally a symbol of nurturing, fortitude, and the sacrosanct tie between mother and child. She is equally adept at bringing life from the earth and removing it. Wine, celebration, fertility, theatre, insanity, and those dubious choices you make after your third glass of whatever he's pouring are all attributes of Dionysus. Clad in ivy, a little tipsy, and perhaps calling forth a panther, he is the divine embodiment of YOLO. Dionysus was born under extremely dramatic circumstances as the son of Zeus and Semele, a mortal woman. When Hera learned, which she naturally did, she deceived Semele into requesting that Zeus show his really divine appearance. It annihilated her, spoiler alert. Ever the problem solver, Zeus carried the unborn Dionysus to term by stitching him into his thigh. Thigh pregnancy, indeed. Nothing in Greek mythology is strange enough to warrant inquiry. Growing up on the road, Dionysus spread chaos, winemaking, and a little existential fear. A boisterous group of woods party crashers, maenads, and satyrs followed him, a roaming circus of ecstasy and possible destruction of property. He worshipped more than grapes and joy. Letting rid of your identity, inhibitions, and perhaps your clothing were all part of Dionysian ceremonies. His festivals were extravagant, immersive, and frequently featured theatre, masks, and dubious choices made outside. Imagine Burning Man with heavenly repercussions. However, Dionysus wasn't all fun and happiness. He had an extremely dramatic temper. Things became strange if you made fun of him, disapproved of his devotion, or disturbed his aura. His own subjects drove one monarch insane and mutilated him when he outlawed his sect. Someone else was transformed into a dolphin. He applied statement punishments rather than light punishments. However, he also had a great deal of sympathy, particularly for misfits, outcasts, and people who didn't fit in with society. In addition to giving voice to the mute and consoling the shattered, he also occasionally changed people into vines, which is most likely symbolic of something. Dionysus is the antithesis of chaos and divine release. He is both art and lunacy, happiness and devastation. The god who gives you creative gifts one minute and then makes you reconsider your life decisions while dancing barefoot in a vineyard the next. The moon, wild animals, the hunt, and the wilderness are all associated with the goddess Artemis. No, I won't explain myself, but she's also the goddess of, yep, that was a threat. One of the few Olympians who didn't require thunderbolts or love potions, Artemis is frequently seen holding a bow in one hand and having zero tolerance in the other. She had a pack of divine wolves, discipline and accuracy. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, came into the world in the manner of an overachiever. Shortly after her own birth, she assisted in the delivery of her own brother. She was done with guys from that point on. She vowed to abstain from romance, marriage, and any kind of emotional weakness. Rather, she hunted stags, wandered through forests, and surrounded herself with a devoted group of girl followers who all shared her passion for the outdoors and lack of interest in drama. It is not the Victorian fainting couch that makes Artemis famous, but rather the touch, me and I, convert you into a dear kind of purity. Consider Actaeon, a hunter who happened to stumble across her taking a bath. Instead of politely explaining limits, she turned him into a stag and allowed his own dogs to rip him to pieces. I got the message. She strongly guarded women and children in particular. Artemis served as a celestial shield for the weak, but many Olympian gods viewed humanity as mere chess pieces or dating apps. Her retribution was quick, poetic, and typically lethal, and she punished anyone who disregarded sacred nature or injured the defenseless. She was a moon goddess who stood for mystery, peace, and clarity. Both physically and figuratively, she led visitors through the dark and offered light to the night. Artemis was the moon's icy, intent gaze, if Apollo was the sun's dazzling radiance. More caution, less warmth. She didn't need to be ostentatious, but she wasn't. Artemis was there. She wasn't challenged by you, she wasn't flirted with by you. All you could hope was that she wasn't aiming for you. Artemis is considered the first autonomous woman in contemporary times. Free, fierce, and completely indifferent to your opinion of her. She was not an Olympus resident. In the woods, she ran. The deity Apollo is associated with the sun, music, healing, prophecy, poetry, archery, and, let's be honest, he put his name on every job opportunity on Mount Olympus. Apollo's profile would have caused the site to crash if the gods had linked in. Apollo is the gleaming, bright poster child of Olympus and Artemis's twin brother. Golden chariot, golden hair, and golden lyre. According to Greek myth, he literally pushed the sun across the sky each day in a fiery chariot, which is why we have daylight. If you're running late, don't worry, but there are a lot of feelings underneath all that genius. Apollo is a showman. He is sentimental. After a breakup, he's the guy who sings ballads and then literally curses the person who turned him down. Consult Daphne. To avoid him, she transformed into a tree. After lamenting her passing, Apollo transformed her into a sacred figure and donned her leaves as a crown, because it's good for you. As the deity of prophecy, he is technically aware that awful things will happen, but he still becomes angry when they occur. The energy of the classic overachiever. He founded the Oracle of Delphi, where priestesses murmured lyrical riddles that miraculously explained everyone's fate while driven by heavenly insanity. Incredibly easy to use. Apollo's connection with love was complex. He pursued a number of mortals, was turned away by the majority, and responded with varied degrees of lyrical exaggeration. Apollo was so upset that he changed the boy into a flower when a Spartan prince named Hyacinthus died during a discus match, probably as a result of Apollo's own badly thrown disc, which, if you disregard the physical force trauma component, is sweet. Apollo, however, was also a healer. Apollo himself had the power to either produce or cure plagues, depending on how upset he was at the moment, and his son Asclepius rose to become the god of medicine. Apollo was, in sum, power disguised as poetry, brilliance wrapped in insecurity, and charm with a short fuse. The type of god that would compose a romantic song and, if you didn't clap, would shoot you with an arrow. The old Greek name for the only Olympian who didn't start weekly worldwide controversies is Hestia, the goddess of the home, hearth, and domestic harmony. In addition to being the oldest of Cronus and Rhea's children, she was also the first to be completely taken in by her suspicious father. When Zeus overthrew him later, she was the last to be thrown back up. Thus, in a technical sense, she is both the youngest and the oldest Olympian. Indeed, Greek mythology is a logical funhouse mirror. Hestia decided to be peaceful in contrast to her more rambunctious siblings. She avoided sleeping with mortals, hurling curses, engaging in power battles, and even casting disparaging remarks. When Dionysus offered her a seat in Olympus, she graciously shrugged and relinquished it. Why? So she could avoid becoming embroiled in family strife while tending to the eternal flame. Queenly conduct. She oversaw the hearth, which is the focal point of every city, temple, and residence. Hestia was there in spirit wherever there was a light burning for ceremony, food, or warmth. Her name is devoid of temples, not a single scandalous myth. The only thing that made everything else function was a silent presence. The original background is necessary. In addition, she was the goddess of hospitality. She stood for the sacred responsibility of tending to visitors in a society where food and shelter meant survival. Your bread wouldn't burn, your fire would remain lit, and maybe your family would depart on schedule if you called her. She also didn't go around transforming people into animals, inanimate objects, or ironic morality lessons like most Olympians did. Hestia didn't require retribution. She had inner tranquility and a clean floor. Every meal started and finished with an offering because of her. "Thank you for not being a handful" was undoubtedly whispered by someone in every prayer circle, and every city had a flame blazing in its heart. Zeus would be the CEO with boundary issues, Athena the overqualified strategist, Dionysus the HR infraction, and Hestia the cool office manager, keeping the lights on and the coffee warm while everyone else quarreled over whose temple was on fire, if the gods were a dysfunctional company. Hestia serves as a reminder that there is strength in silence, worth in simplicity, and that sometimes the most important person is the one who keeps everything together without asking for attention. One of the most intriguing characters in Greek mythology is Persephone, a goddess whose dual personality is etched into the seasons. She is the iron throne and the floral crown, the beauty of spring and the chill of death, life and decay. She is already associated with life and fertility because she is the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. However, as is frequently the case in Greek myth, things changed when Hades, the lord of the underworld, noticed her plucking flowers and decided she would make a good wife. Without talking to her or getting coffee first, he kidnapped her and took her down into the underworld. Naturally, Demeter was crushed. She searched the land and stopped all agricultural when no one could tell her where Persephone had disappeared. The outcome? An enraged crowd of hungry mortals and a worldwide famine. Zeus finally stepped in because no one was making sacrifices while starving, not because he was worried about his father. They came to an agreement. If Persephone hadn't eaten anything in the underworld, which she obviously had, she could return. She had consumed 6 pomegranate seeds, which would have legally bound her to a part-time job in the afterlife. So started her dual function, spending half the year with Hades in the underworld, bringing us fall and winter, and the other half on earth with Demeter, bringing us spring and summer. The idea of seasonal depression was created by the ancient Greeks, but this is where things start to get interesting. Persephone eventually came to accept her position as Queen of the Dead. She was more than a dejected flower girl who had been abducted. Calm, firm, and quietly dominant, she rose to become a monarch. Mortals prayed to her for understanding the balance between life and death, for mercy, and for safe passage. She is a symbol of emotional as well as seasonal change, the transition from helplessness to power, from being captured to taking charge. The goddess of duality is Persephone. She moves as gracefully through flowers as she does through bones. It is because of her that flowers both bloom and wilt. Psyche was being compared to a goddess before she was old enough to comprehend the term. When she became a lady, sculptures of Aphrodite were collecting dust, and mortals went great distances to see this mortal girl's face. Her beauty was adored, not just appreciated. She was regarded by entire audiences as though she were Aphrodite, reincarnated in human form. She must be divine, many said, for no mortal woman could ever appear like her by chance. All the respect, however, seemed meaningless to Psyche. Like a ghost, she moved through towns and cities, loved yet untouchable, praised but isolated. Nobody was brave enough to approach her with genuine love. Men regarded her as a live painting, impeccable, silent, and impervious to touch. Even her proud relatives became uncomfortable. Psyche herself yearned for the kind of warm, anchored existence that her two sisters had, having married aristocratic men and started families. The risk, however, was that no suitor would venture to court a girl who was thought to be Aphrodite's competitor. As you can see, the gods, particularly Aphrodite, disliked rivalry. The goddess was filled with heavenly wrath as she watched her temples go silent while mortals placed garlands at the feet of a simple girl. She didn't think Psyche was a pretty kid. She was a flesh and blood insult. Psyche, however, was unaware of this. She walked the grounds by herself, talking to no one. She had never heard a vow made in the dark or felt the touch of a lover. She was separated from the one thing she really desired, a soul that saw her, not just her face, by her beauty, which had turned into a curse. Perhaps this was her destiny, to be loved by everyone but held by no one, as she would stand by her window at nightfall and watch the horizon disappear. Until one day someone did. No priest, no oracle, and no stranger ever provided a response. However, it was neither a mortal nor a priest or a man. It was a goddess. Furthermore, she was wanting retribution rather than affection. Beauty was more than vanity on Mount Olympus. It was power, and Aphrodite was the only one with it. She was the goddess of exquisite charm, seduction, and desire. Her temples, however, reverberated with emptiness lately. Under the sun, her statue stood lonesomely. Why? Because Psyche, a human girl, was suddenly revered by mortals as if she were the new goddess of love. This was not only disrespectful to Aphrodite, but also treasonous. From her heavenly vantage point, the goddess saw her jealousy turning into animosity. For less, she had destroyed kings. What right does a mortal female have to take her worshippers? She is a live insult to divine beauty. How dare she exist? Thus, Aphrodite followed the custom of goddesses. She called forth Eros, her son. Eros was no mere god now. Yes, he was the god of love, but not the kind of sensitive love that inspired mortal poets to write poetry. No, anarchy was how Eros handled. Where there shouldn't have been passion, he ignited it. He made queens fall for slaves, kings for con artists, and rivals for one another. He asked no permission to shoot his arrows. They destroyed loyalty, reason, and occasionally whole civilizations. Aphrodite gave a straightforward order. Make Psyche fall in love with the world's most repulsive and ugly creature. Something hideous, something that was underneath the worms themselves. Allow her to experience what it's like to have love make fun of you. Ever the dutiful son, Eros agreed. With a quiver full of divine arrows slung over his back, Bao entered the mortal world when it was still dark. In her chamber he discovered Psyche dozing, her face flashing like water in the candlelight. She was too stunningly gorgeous. After piercing 1,000 hearts, Eros sensed the pulse of his own skipper. This was incorrect. The plan did not include this. He still reached for his arrow, but something went wrong while he was preoccupied. He let his hand slip. Only a drop of the arrow pricked his skin. However, it was sufficient. Just then, fate changed because the god of love had succumbed to his own might. Eros would be Psyche's silent guardian instead of his mother's weapon. However, neither of them was aware of the cost the gods would impose for their forbidden love. Furthermore, treason would not be tolerated by Aphrodite. With the wound from his own arrow still warm on his flesh, Eros disappeared before Psyche could awaken. Despite having punctured several hearts, he had never once succumbed to his own tricks. He now experienced an inexplicable desire with each heartbeat to shield her from Olympus's ruthless gaze, to treasure her, to protect her. But sacrifice was necessary for protection. He was unable to be honest with her. Aphrodite would not show mercy to him or Psyche if she found out that he had disobeyed her, let alone that he had fallen in love. Eros then made a silent promise. In the dark, he would adore her. Psyche's life, meantime, became increasingly bizarre every day. There were no suitors. Once a sight to behold, her beauty now appeared cursed. Rumors of divine retribution circulated throughout the realm. Desperate and terrified, her father sought advice from the oracle of Apollo. The remarks that came back were harsh. She will never marry a mortal guy. Rather, she will wed a monster, a creature that even the gods fear. Dressed like a bride, send her to the top of the mountain. Her fate is waiting there. As though the wind had chiseled her into stone, Psyche stood motionless and mute while her sisters gasped and her relatives mourned. A monster? Was this her fate? Not sacrifice, not choice, but love? Nevertheless, she consented out of resignation more than bravery. Love had never touched her, yet she had been worshipped like a goddess. Maybe it was just balance, this terrible, terrible fate. From above, Eros watched, his heart twisted with remorse. He had intended to keep her safe, but the gods had woven a web that was impossible to unravel. Psyche would be lost if he did nothing, but his mother would know if he openly intervened. So he came up with a scheme. Under the guise of illusion and stillness, he would lead her to a secret location, a hidden palace that only he knew existed. He would adore her as a shadow rather than as a god. He would never reveal his identity to her, he would never say his name, and most importantly, he would never be honest with her. Because everything would fall apart if she found out who he was and who she was really with. The deity of love himself feared heartbreak. Psyche was whisked away from the mountain top by a gentle yet powerful wind. Gnashing teeth and chilly rock were what she had anticipated. She had waited for the roar of a monster, but quiet instead. Silence, soft, dreamlike. She was no longer on the mountain when she opened her eyes. She was standing in a field of bright flowers that shone brighter than any garden she had ever seen. The area was crisscrossed by a polished stone road that led to an impossibly large palace beyond human construction. Their halls silently whispered her name, and their pillars glistened like moonlight on water. Anticipating terror, Psyche entered the room and discovered tranquility instead. Unseen servants held her hands, cleaned her feet, and draped her shoulders in robes. No one was setting the table, but the food looked fragrant and warm. A deep, gentle, and compassionate voice whispered from the darkness at night. "Don't be scared. You're secure. You live here." The oracle had promised her an unseen husband, and it was him. However, there was only a voice and no hideous shape or snarling beast. Oddly enough, it didn't scare her. Even in the dark, he never showed himself. He accompanied her every night in the peaceful velvet of the bedroom. Like a dream, he touched her face. He chuckled softly in her ear. And he left before the sun rose every morning. Love without sight, intimacy without form, she was slipping quickly. She longed for more with every word he said. However, he continually pleaded with me to never try to see me. "Why?" she said once, gently. The voice stiffened. "I have to be gone from you forever if you see me." So she did what she was told. But the more days that went by, the more the mystery weighed. How could the oracle's predicted monster be such a gentle, considerate man? Why must the face of love be hidden? And why did he never murmur his name when she did? Psyche assured herself that she didn't need to know and that it didn't matter. However, the human heart is an oddity, and once doubt is sown, it seldom stays buried for long, particularly when relatives visit or when sisters bring poison masquerading as love. Weeks, maybe months, had passed. In the invisible palace, time moved in an odd way. Psyche was familiar with luxury, love, laughter, and tranquility. However, she also understood loneliness, no names, faces, or truth, just a voice in the shadows and darkness kissing her lips. Then her husband's voice changed one morning. "If you see them, sorrow will follow," he added. "Who can you see?" "Your sisters. They think they are motivated by love. However, they bring devastation." The heart of Psyche broke. She missed them. The warmth, the teasing, the envy. They served as her final link to the mortal world and the girl she had once been before mysterious spouses, castles, and gods. She begged, "Just once, please, let me see them." Despite his hesitation, Eros was unable to reject her. He gave one warning before agreeing. "Don't allow their remarks to contaminate our possessions. They will attempt to betray your confidence. You can't listen." Thus, Psyche's sisters were transported to the invisible palace's garden gates by the winds that had previously lifted her. They were taken aback upon seeing her. She was radiant, alive, and more than that. Her skin was sparkling like stars, and she was dressed in silks more exquisite than any queen's. With hesitant laughter and brittle smiles that concealed their jealousy, they embraced her. "Your husband is where?" someone inquired. Psyche grinned. "He only shows up at night. I haven't seen him before." The sisters stopped. She nodded. "You've never seen him." "He won't reveal his face to you." The other person let out a gasp. "But what if he's a beast, ugly, or worse? What if he is one of the gods who is laughing behind your back and taking advantage of you?" Though Psyche sensed the shift, their voices were brimming with sweet concern. There was still the classic sibling rivalry, but it had taken on a darker twist. Their remarks were sharpened by jealousy. "He keeps you blind, hidden, and reliant." Is that incarceration or love? It was mistrust that was sown. They grinned as they watched it take root. They whispered, "Just take a lamp one night and see for yourself," and kissed her cheeks as they walked away. What harm can truth do to you if he loves you? For the first time since coming to heaven, Psyche was unable to stop shaking as she watched them vanish into the breeze. From curiosity, not fear, Psyche had trouble falling asleep that night. His arms were softly curved about her as she lay in the dark, covered in silk sheets, and his breath was steady next to hers. However, her thinking was louder than love and louder than his heart. Like a spell, her sister's words kept coming back to her. Could he be a monster? What if you're being used by him? What if he isn't who you believe him to be? She had made a blind trust. She had fully surrendered to a voice in the shadows. Was it love, though, or was it just surrender? Soundless as snow, she crept out of bed. She had a small bronze oil light with a lit wick in her hand when her bare feet touched the chilly floor. As she got closer, her heart pounded in her chest. She leaned closer, her fingers shaking, and she gasped as the light hit his face. Not a monster, not a disguised god, a man of unfathomable beauty. Soft lips curving in sleep, golden curls tangled on the pillow, and wings, feathery and lovely, folded like a secret on his back. She had been selected by Eros, the god of love. Her eyes welled up with tears of remorse rather than dread. She had doubted, but he had loved her, warned her, and trusted her. Before the light went out, she wanted to whisper an apology and bend in to kiss his lips. However, fate is unkind. His naked shoulder was touched by a single drop of burning oil that poured from the lamp. He cried out in agony and betrayal when he woke up. His eyes widened with grief, and his wings spread wide. His voice was empty as he said, "You broke your promise. You have more faith in fear than in love. "I apologize," Psyche muttered as she dropped to her knees. "I simply wanted to know." Eros took a step back, his light fading. "You do now." Then he disappeared into the shadows. At his back, the palace fell apart. Their common invisible world disintegrated like smoke. With the lamp still warm in her fingers and her heart, Psyche found herself by herself on a desolate hillside. Broken. The god of love had appeared to her, and lost him. To doubt, not to fate, the world seemed increasingly colder as Psyche travelled, broken and barefoot. Gone are the silken corridors, the verdant gardens, and the voice that used to soothe her to sleep. There was no response from the skies, the ground offered no consolation. All that was left was her regret. There was pain in every step. In meadows, forests, rivers, and even dreams she cried out to Eros. However, no response was received, not from Olympus but from her own life. The god of love had disappeared. Psyche went back to her father's house in despair. However, the palace that had once loved her was now rife with gossip. Triumphant in her suffering, her sisters said she had lost everything and married a devil. Her story of flying spouses, gods, and love was not taken seriously. So she went out once more, this time with purpose rather than exile. No matter how far she had to travel, or what kind of anger she may encounter, even if it meant going inside Olympus itself, she would find Eros. However, mortals don't just ascend to the heavens. So she looked for the one who had begun it all, the only one who could lead her. Aphrodite. Psyche was scared indeed. She was the object of the goddess's hatred. However, Psyche would endure even Olympus's wrath in order to gain forgiveness, if there was any chance that Eros still loved her. She discovered Aphrodite in a secluded garden with mirrors surrounding it, rather than in a golden temple. The goddess gazed at her own image as though seeking imperfections that were not there. Psyche came closer, but Aphrodite didn't turn. The goddess responded icily, "I warned you once, and you still touched what was mine." Psyche dropped on her knees. "I adore him." Aphrodite chuckled. "Do you adore him? You mean your betraying son? The deity you questioned?" Psyche acknowledged that I was stupid, but I will stop at nothing to regain his confidence. With piercing eyes, Aphrodite turned. "Anything?" Psyche gave a nod. It was a cruel smile from the goddess. "You'll suffer as a result. You will be put to the test, and maybe, just maybe, after your suffering, you will be deserving of my son." This was the start of a test of dedication rather than strength, and Psyche would have to face it by herself. Aphrodite wasted no time. In addition to her fabled beauty, she was equally divinely cruel when provoked. Psyche would have to prove herself through a series of unimaginable trials if she desired even the chance to meet Eros again. The first challenge was surprisingly easy. She followed Aphrodite into a huge storage room where mountains of seeds, barley, millet, lentils, poppies, wheat, and beans spread out on the floor in an unidentifiable jumble. Aphrodite yawned and said, "By nightfall separate them, every grain, every seed, into their proper pile. You will never see my son again if you fail." Then, humming to herself, she walked away. Psyche gazed at the unachievable assignment. It would take more than 1,000 hands to clean up such a mess in a single day. Still, she dropped to her knees and started plucking seed after seed, her fingers trembling. Hours elapsed in minutes. Her gaze grew hazy. She had not even reached the halfway point. However, both the gods and their animals are constantly on guard. A line of ants had been observing her labor without Psyche's knowledge. Not any ants, though. Demeter, the harvest goddess, held these in high regard. Maybe they felt sorry for the girl. Love might have moved them. The floor was suddenly a frenzy of movement, hundreds of little legs racing across it. With startling accuracy, the ants divided the seeds into living rivers. The disorder was resolved in a matter of minutes. Millet in tidy pyramids, barley to one side, and lentils on the other. It was similar to witnessing the laws of time being rewritten by nature itself. Aphrodite was greeted with perfection rather than failure when she returned at dusk. Her eyes narrowed. "You had assistance," she yelled. Psyche's head bowed. All I could do was what I could. Aphrodite's lips quirked with a mixture of amusement and rage. She had not anticipated that the mortal girl would finish the assignment, much less gracefully. But whatever. Many more hardships were yet to come, more difficult ones, more deadly ones. The deity cautioned that this was just the beginning. It will take more than just good fortune to see Eros again. Despite her fatigue and pain, Psyche stood and nodded. Whatever it takes, I'll do it, because pure love was more valuable than mortal pride or divine comfort. And the struggle of Psyche was far from over. Aphrodite gave Psyche the second duty, which was even more harsh in its design, before she had had chance to rest. "Look down there at that river." Pointing to a meandering brook that glinted in the afternoon sun, the goddess posed the question. "It passes next to a field where untamed rams graze. They use gold to make their wool. Try not to die, but bring me a handful of it, a tuft." Psyche was left to deal with what she knew was more than an easy task after she smirked and disappeared. These were not kind animals. With their wild eyes and spear-sharp horns, the golden rams were revered. They were reputed to rip invaders apart without warning and to gore anything that entered their field. Glistening like treasure, they fiercely guarded it. Still, Psyche descended the slope and came to the field. She watched the beasts roam while crouching near the reeds, her heart racing. Against the stones their hooves broke, their snarls were deep and savage. She couldn't possibly make it inside their territory during the day. Fear gnawing at her resolve, tears streaming down her face, she fell to her knees. But the world watched once more. A soft murmur filtered over the long grass. A gentle voice, rhythmically swaying like reeds. It was an ancient entity, tethered to the stream, a spirit of the river. The spirit whispered, "Do not go into the field while the sun is high." The rams savage during the day, but they take a nap in the shade as dusk approaches. After waiting, collect the wool that has snagged on the prickly branches. It won't be missed by any beast. Hope came back. Psyche waited. Hours went by. One by one, the golden rams drifted into the trees and fell asleep. She moved cautiously and quietly as night fell, discovering golden fleeced tufts entangled in bark and brambles. She collected the wool under the moonlight and went back to Aphrodite, who squinted at the glittering handful in Psyche's hand. "You are alive." "Curious," the goddess mumbled again. But because love had taught her something even the gods had forgotten, Psyche remained silent and strong without boasting or boasting. While courage becomes silent, it persists, and Psyche was far from done battling, even though Aphrodite was still testing her. Aphrodite was becoming impatient. Psyche had used only willpower and an odd, unshakable luck to withstand trials that were supposed to break her. Cold calculation had taken the place of the goddess's smile. She therefore assigned Psyche a task for the third trial, which ought to have put a definitive end to her tale. She answered, "Get me water from the river Styx itself, not from a stream or a well." Psyche went pallid. The Styx River was not like other rivers. It delineated the line between the world of the living, from the world of the dead. Its waters were deadly to touch, holy and cursed. Even the gods were afraid to approach it. Mortals didn't even make it back, let alone survive its banks. Psyche nodded nonetheless. Her path brought her to the brink of a sheer rock face that appeared to have been chiseled by titans. Vaporous curses and the laments of lost souls rose from the Styx river, which churned far below like black glass. Instead of flowing, its current coiled like a living snake. Even worse, sentries from the underworld, terrible winged creatures, were defending the river. Their claws were sharp enough to rip bone from flesh, and they screeched and swooped at anything that moved. There was no hope, no way up, and no way down. Clutching the crystal vial that Aphrodite had made fun of her, she fell under a rock ledge. The goddess had instructed, "Just a sip, enough to show you tried." Then there was a glimmer. A tiny creature appeared from a crevice in the stone, and the air was filled with a high-pitched buzz. A stately, golden-eyed eagle, enormous by bird standards, sent by the eagle of thunder and rulers, Zeus himself. It grabbed the bottle from Psyche's hand, extended its wings, and flew down the lethal cliff without saying a word. Even death obeyed Zeus's orders, so even though the sentries screamed, they dared not attack. The eagle reappeared in a matter of seconds and placed the sealed vial containing the glistening, cursed waters of Styx in Psyche's shaking hands. Zeus helped her, but she didn't ask why. Maybe Eros had aided him before. Perhaps the persistence of love was revered even by the gods. Aphrodite took the vial in icy silence when Psyche returned to her. Though not all love tales survive a voyage into the underworld, Psyche had once again passed away, and the ultimate trial would lead her to a place even the gods would be afraid to tread. The Styx itself was not as chilly as Aphrodite's words. "You will travel to the realm of Hades for your last task," she added. "There you shall plead for a box of Queen Persephone's beauty. You see, a present for me. I've been feeling very exhausted recently. I'm tired of you. The penalty was death. The underworld was avoided even by the bravest mortals." Psyche no longer hesitated, but the living did not go into Hades' world and come back. She would not be deterred by darkness if it were the route to Eros. She discovered a secret entry, a cave that punctured the surface of the planet like a forgotten scar, led by murmurs from empathetic voices. Some say Demeter, others say invisible demons of kindness. She brought barley cakes for Cerberus, the three-headed hound, and 2 coins for Charon, the ferryman. Her bones lost warmth with each step she took deeper. Silence, not smoke, filled the dense air. She passed pale, hollow, unreachable souls that drifted like memories. Charon took her money at the river Acheron and took her on a ride through quiet waters, tainted with anguish that had been forgotten. Persephone gave the pastries to Cerberus when he snarled at the entrance to her palace. He licked his blood-stained jaws and became silent. With eyes like polished garnets, Persephone sat calmly on her obsidian throne inside. "Not rudely," the queen answered. "You come for beauty. However, at what price?" Psyche answered. "I don't want it for myself. Aphrodite needs to receive it from me." Persephone nodded. Maybe she knew the chaos of love too. She gave Psyche a tiny, unmarked, sealed box that was incredibly hefty despite its simplicity. "Avoid opening it," the queen said. Psyche thanked her before turning to go, saying, "It is not meant for your eyes." The return trip was peaceful, but now more difficult due to temptation. In her hands the box throbbed. It couldn't hurt to have a look, surely? No, she told herself, again and again. As previously, however, uncertainty began to creep in. What if she was once more deserving of Eros because of her beauty? Could this be the last key? It was close to the surface. Her fingers twitched, her heart pounded, and she opened the box as darkness engulfed her, as light came back to her face for the first time in days. A chilly mist poured out of the box like a breath from the afterlife as soon as Psyche opened it, expecting beauty and light. It was neither celestial illumination nor beauty. Persephone created the deathless slumber of the underworld, not just any sleep to maintain her dominance, not to make Aphrodite look beautiful. Psyche didn't let out a cry. She didn't pass out. She just fell, the sealed box next to her, her limbs immobilized, her breath muted, her body descending gently onto the grass at the edge of the mortal realm. She wasn't living, but she wasn't dead either. Her curiosity had stopped her heart, leaving her in a perpetual halt. And that could have been Psyche's demise. However, love has the ability to endure death. Eros had not forgotten her far away on Olympus. His heart had not healed, but his wounds had. At his mother's order, he had stayed away, haunted by images of Psyche struggling through unachievable difficulties. And he knew when he heard that she had gone into the underworld. For love, she had defied Aphrodite and risked death to accomplish it for him. The girl wasn't mortal, she was a queen. Eros exploded from Olympus in a blaze of wings and gold, defying his mother. The clouds parted at his heels as he sped through the sky until he discovered her, still and quiet, resting like a marble statue, kissed by the setting sun. Beside her, he collapsed to his knees and started crying. Tears of anger, regret, and love, too great for words, not tears of grief. Gently, he lifted the box and closed it. Then he leaned down and kissed her lips without thinking twice. Just a kiss, a promise, a remembrance, a request, not a spell or a miraculous kiss. And she opened her eyes. The cloud of slumber lifted, and Psyche gasped. Before she could say anything, her hands were out for him. She breathed, Eros. "You returned," he muttered. "You have always been loved by me." He embraced her more tightly than before. All of the gods who had been watching, some pleased, some enraged, finally understood in that moment. He had even defeated the deity of love. Olympus trembled at their reunion. The god of love, Eros, had disobeyed his mother. Mortal Psyche had refused to die, and together they had transcended the limits of duty and desire, of divine and human. Love like that was dangerous. Aphrodite felt furious. Demanding punishment, she barged into the god's court. She exclaimed, "This mortal has corrupted my son, tampered with sacred laws and ridiculed the gods. She needs to be removed." The gods, however, were no longer so sure. They had observed Psyche's hardships, her pain, her tenacity, and her recovery. What no mortal love ever had, her love had endured. Nevertheless, a decision had to be made. They then looked to Zeus. With fate in one hand and lightning in the other, the ruler of the gods sat still on his throne. From Psyche's decline to her ascent, from her uncertainty to her loyalty, he had witnessed it all. Finally, he said something. Zeus asserted that enduring love possesses power. He held up a hand as Aphrodite opened her mouth to object. "More than any mortal I have ever seen, she has passed the tests you have put her through. She proves that even mortals can love like gods. Thus, she is not unworthy of Olympus." Then he looked at Psyche and Eros. "You genuinely want to be with each other forever." Both of them gave a nod, then whatever. Zeus conjured forth a tumbler of ambrosia, the god's beverage, with a simple wave of his hand. He extended his hand to Psyche. "You will no longer be mortal if you drink. Your heart will continue to beat forever. Among us your soul shall reside." However, your hardships won't be forgotten. Like all of us, you will carry the tales that have shaped who we are. The goblet went to Psyche. She did not shake her hands. She drank. She felt a flowering, rather than scorching, warmth. Her senses grew, like a bell tolling across millennia. Her heartbeat first slowed and then deepened. She suddenly became heavenly, neither mortal nor inferior. After Eros took her hand, they were pronounced husband and wife in front of all of Olympus. For once, love had not ended tragically, it was crowned. The change was complete, both physically and spiritually, the instant Psyche sipped the ambrosia. Her eyes were filled with galaxies instead of tears, and her skin glistened with celestial beauty. Once mocking her mortal blood, the gods now gazed in wonder. For the first time in the lengthy history of Olympus, a mortal had gained her position among them via devotion rather than ancestry. Psyche the beautiful and Psyche the girl were no longer her. Now she was immortal Psyche, a deity unto herself. Even Aphrodite, who had cursed her, was unable to ignore the woman in front of her, one who had endured loneliness, betrayal, temptation, and death, and still had chosen love over pride. Nevertheless, the goddess of love was slow to pardon. However, Eros, Psyche's spouse and his mother's son, came forth. "Mother," he whispered softly, "she is no match for your beauty. The soul that comprehends love is someone else totally." The stress was enough relieved in that instant, though not entirely. Aphrodite gave up when she remained silent. Psyche, whose name in Greek means both soul and breath of life, was declared by Zeus to be her goddess of the soul. Her struggles had made her the personification of what love endures, not a statue of perfection. There was a huge feast on Olympus. The stars danced in joy, nectar poured like rivers, and even the fates grinned at the tale they had once whispered. Psyche was no longer unsure or scared, and stood alongside Eros. She had the same status. She was divine. As protectors of love and the soul's journey, they gazed together at the heavens above and the mortal earth below. And a daughter was born out of their union. The goddess of pleasure and delight, Hedone, represents the joy that results from the union of soul and love. Psyche danced amid eternal brightness, where she had previously strolled among shadows and thorns. She had loved, fallen, grieved, and risen again, not because she was flawless. She served as evidence that one hardship at a time, even mortals and the heartbroken may ascend to the sky. As a result, unlike many mortal love stories, the story of Eros and Psyche ended in transformation rather than catastrophe. Not into myth, but into something much bigger, a reality that has been muttered for generations, from dreamers to storytellers, from beds to temples. True love is not simple. It has been put to the test. It is questioned. It's injured. However, it becomes eternal when it survives. Beauty, a curse. Psyche never requested, had been the starting point of her journey. Gods had manipulated her. Sisters had envied her, and strangers had worshipped her. She had suffered punishment for receiving love and again for returning that love. Even after her faith faltered and her heart shattered, she continued to try. She continued to walk. He also learned about the deity of love, Eros. That love is not a game, a weapon, or a covert secret. Yes, it is light, but only while facing. Together they imparted a lesson that Olympus had long since forgotten. Love is not just for the gods. Whoever is prepared to battle for it has it. Lovers' prayers were offered to Psyche as well as Aphrodite in Greek temples. Before weddings, births, and even funerals, they would mutter her name. She served as a reminder that the soul can endure adversity, since she was more than just a deity. That love has the capacity to rise anew after falling, and that the heart knows the way back, regardless of how deep the underworld is or how harsh the trial. The myth endures to this day, long after empires have fallen and temples have crumbled. Psyche is a word that means soul. Psychology is defined as the study of the soul. And Eros and Psyche endure not as marble sculptures, but as echoes within each of us, in every story where love is tried and overcomes. We follow their path each time we choose love over silence, forgiveness over pride, and trust over fear. And maybe we become a little more divine like them. Medusa was a mortal girl who was unmatched in beauty long before she was feared, before sculptures froze in mid-scream, and before serpents murmured across marble floors. Her beauty just was, uninvited, like sunlight creeping through stone. It was neither loud nor arrogant. Though silent, her presence unnerved both monarchs and gods. Her eyes possessed the serenity of oceans before storms, and her hair shimmered like threads of midnight silk. In an era when monsters were both feared and revered, she was born into a family of monsters. By design, her sisters Euryale and Stheno were fierce, immortal, and terrible. Medusa, however, was unique. Only she was mortal. Only she could perish. Maybe that made her even more valuable. However, Medusa had no desire for a throne, lovers, or a crown of divine favor. Devotion, something rarer, was her choice. She joined the revered service of Athena, the virgin goddess of temperance, wisdom, and combat, when she was a young lady. Long before dawn, Medusa swept the floors, lighted the incense, and muttered prayers in the resonant marble temple perched high on cliffs above the sea. She made the vows of silence, virginity, and purity because she believed in them, not because she was compelled to. In addition to being a goddess, she revered Athena as an ideal, strong, untouchable, and above the turmoil of mortal hearts. Over time, even the populace started to speculate that Medusa was actually a living statue of Athena. While feigning to pray, worshippers would steal looks at her. Her voice was hardly heard, her existence was confined to religious duty, and her visage became a symbol. However, even at a temple, beauty is not secure. Beyond the boundaries of the temple, across the cities, through the woodlands and into the world of the gods, word of Medusa's grace spread, and danger accompanied it, because in Olympus the distinction between adoration and ownership was extremely blurred, and desire frequently had a divine face. In particular, one god paid attention, a god of oceans, storms, and appetites, not a god of wisdom or self-control. Despite Medusa's adherence to her vows, fate had already started to turn against her. Because even purity can be punished in the world of gods, Medusa's haven would soon turn into her jail. Poseidon controlled the oceans with pride, rage, and an unquenchable thirst, far below the roaring waves and coral palaces of the deep. He had claimed goddesses, created storms, and tamed creatures. Now, however, his gaze shifted to something much less divine, eternal, Medusa. Even Olympus had been able to appreciate her beauty, but what captivated him was her composure, her self-control, and her unwavering elegance. She didn't belong to any mortal monarch, deity, or man. She had positioned herself far from desire by choosing a life of dedication, and maybe that was Poseidon's greatest temptation. He watched her pray more and more. And Poseidon emerged from the sea one evening when the tide was high and the temple was deserted. He didn't knock. Rarely do gods request consent. Water gathered beneath his feet, a path of sea water soaking the marble floor as he approached the hallowed temple of Athena. Unaware and alone, Medusa turned to see the sea god lurking in the darkness, his trident gone, but his hunger still very much alive. Her pleas were unheard as she screamed out to Athena. She took off running. However, temples were not intended for escape, they were constructed for worship, and Poseidon desecrated what was holy there under the statue of Athena's icy stone gaze. There was no seduction involved, it was against the law. When all was over, Poseidon disappeared, leaving behind quiet and salt. Broken, Medusa snuggled under the image of her goddess, yearning for anything divine, for solace, for justice. However, gods aren't always fair. Athena was enraged when she returned to her temple and discovered the devastation. Not at Poseidon, though, in Medusa. Athena accused her priestess of let the temple to be desecrated, whether due to pride, denial, or divine law. It didn't matter if she thought Medusa was merely inconvenient or culpable. Her sanctuary's innocence has been shattered. Therefore, the goddess of wisdom judged the mortal who had been violated rather than the god who had done so, because power defends itself even in myth. And Medusa, formerly a representation of holy beauty, would now become an unavoidable warning. When Athena reappeared, seawater still marred the temple floor. The incense was long since extinguished. There was a heavy hush. And in the middle of all, Medusa knelt in humiliation, her head lowered under her goddess's unwavering stare. Athena's eyes, however, were not sympathetic. They were enraged. Because she had polluted her temple, her haven of discipline, reason, and virgin purity. And even though Poseidon had trespassed, Medusa was held accountable. Forgiveness was impossible to Athena. Temples never forgot, and gods never expressed regret. The penalty had to be permanent and symbolic. She descended from the pedestal of her statue and stood over Medusa, who was shivering and bewildered as she awaited forgiveness from the same goddess she had long revered. But there was no mercy. Rather, the sound of Athena's words reverberated between marble walls like thunder. My home is now a place of shame because of you. Let the world witness what happens when beauty invites devastation. She stroked Medusa's forehead with a single motion, reaching down. The change happened instantly. The golden hair became writhing snakes. A vicious imitation of muttered prayers was hissing there. The warmth left her flesh. Her eyes turned into a weapon. Her eyes, which had once been gentle with grief, now had a frightening strength. You could turn to stone if you looked into them. No invasion, no foes, no one. It wasn't a protective penalty. It was solitude, a curse masquerading as protection. With a cry that was no longer human, Medusa exclaimed. Once salt water, her tears now dried before they fell. She stopped breathing. Mirrors were broken by her reflection. To make matters worse, she was unable to gaze at another soul without destroying it. Athena remained silent. She didn't look away. She just watched as her priestess, who had been pious and lovely, changed completely. A monster. Medusa escaped into exile, her laments resonating through the hills, and the temple doors closed behind her. No house, not a temple, no sisters, no invocations. She left just stone traces behind. Unfazed, Athena returned to her throne from the Olympus cliffs. Because punishment need only be long-lasting in the sight of the gods, not fair. Furthermore, Medusa's face would endure beyond recollection. Medusa was banished from the city and temple and travelled into the forest by herself, where she was feared and cursed. Her footsteps left a trail of stone across the terrain, reducing it to dead marble with every unintentional look at a passing animal. Deer in the underbrush, birds in mid-air, and even insects that dared look into her eyes were all silently frozen in place. She went to a desolate, windswept island at the edge of the globe, uninhabited by either gods or humans, in the far-off places beyond rivers and ruin, where no man would pursue her. She didn't construct any shelter there. With the stars providing no solace, what good was a roof? When her adversaries used to be her protectors, what good were walls? She entered a cave that was already partially occupied by statues, monsters, long-forgotten soldiers, or maybe even other travelers who briefly locked eyes with her. She then started a second life as a pariah rather than a priestess. Medusa stopped crying. Tears belonged to the girl she used to be, the girl who felt loyalty might win her love, who believed in justice, and who offered Athena incense. On the floor of the temple, that girl had perished. Something else, not a monster, but a woman molded by treachery, took her place. In dreams, her serpent spoke to her in instincts rather than words, alerting her of intruders and the sound of approaching footsteps. Her eyes had become her curse, her soul a fading memory, and her hair her protectors. She started etching pictures of faces, hands, the temple she used to work at, and even her sisters on the walls of her cave. Stone was all she had left, and her memories were fading. Heroes would occasionally appear, enticed by tales of a girl who had been cursed, or by the prospect of defeating a beast. None of them came back, despite their belief that she was terrible, and that they would rise in glory by killing her. They undervalued her suffering in addition to her strength. Nevertheless, Medusa felt more like the monster the world had imagined, and less like a victim with every death. Her humanity was waning, but it had not died. What about the gods? They had already turned their heads. Her name started to shift in the busy city-states and holy temples of Greece, far from Medusa's cave. It spread from mouth to mouth like a warning, twisted, repeated, and deformed, and was no longer said in sadness. The Gorgon, Medusa, the cursed temptress Medusa. Men are turned to stone by Medusa's gaze. Underneath myth lay her history as a devout priestess, a mortal girl who served the gods. It was replaced with a monster's tail, a serpent-haired creature with the underworld's anger visible in its eyes. They kept Poseidon's transgression a secret. They made no mention of Athena's harsh penalty. Priests and poets who wanted their gods clean and their monsters distinctly marked smoothed over the duties of the gods. Medusa would appear in the night if children did not obey their parents. Instead of honoring her, soldiers made fun of her by carving her likeness onto shields. Her visage turned into a warning story and a symbol of fear. Nevertheless, her image became viral. She was painted on ceramics by artists. Across mosaics, her twisted silhouette danced. The very gods who had expelled her had etched her snarling visage into the temple walls, not out of respect, but as a weapon. The weight of their words was all that Medusa, who was in exile, could feel. She made no request to become famous. She made no request to be feared. She had just made it through. For those in positions of authority, survival is also a threat. Some whispered that she was more than a monster on the mainland. In mountain settlements, elderly ladies made sacrifices around caves, whispering that Medusa shielded injured women. She was not feared by them. They felt sorry for her. She was referred to as the guardian of the wronged. However, the boom of hero stories overpowered these gentle voices. Unaware of how profoundly her name had divided, Medusa stayed hidden. To some, a monster. To others, a martyr. She was aware of this. They would come no matter how far she hid. Sword-wielding men in gleaming armor, men who believed that killing her would bring them fame. Men who were only interested in what she had become and never in who she was. And a new rival was already emerging someplace, a youngster who would become her last guest, a man and a hero. A boy named Perseus was born to a different type of silence, When Medusa was living in exile and her legend was growing like wildfire, a prophecy prison. In an attempt to thwart a prophecy that her son would eventually kill him, his father, King Acrisius, had imprisoned his mother Danae in a bronze tower. However, mortal locks are not respected by the gods. Zeus slipped past barriers and cautions to arrive in Dania as golden rain rather than with love. Perseus was born as a result of the celestial encounter. The king was afraid to slay a son of Zeus straight after finding the infant. So, in a silent act of cowardice, he threw mother and child into the water while they were trapped in a wooden casket. However, Poseidon's sea took them to safety rather than death. A fisherman took them in after they washed up on the island of Seriphos. Perseus was reared in concealment by Danae, who instilled in him the values of fortitude, modesty, and survival through silence. Zeus' name was never spoken by her. She never revealed to her son the type of god who had created him. Years went by. Perseus developed into a bright young man who was untried but intelligent and powerful. Then Polydectes, the Seriphos monarch, arrived. He desired to have Danae all to himself. The obstruction was Perseus. Perseus was invited to a feast by the monarch, who pretended to be nice. Every visitor was expected to bring a gift. Poor and arrogant, Perseus brought nothing. Polydectes scoffed, "Then bring me Medusa's head." There was laughter. He was supposed to be humiliated. However, stung by pride and ignorant of the meaning of the name, Perseus agreed. The gods looked on curiously. Perhaps still feeling bad about what she had done to Medusa, Athena sensed an opening. She would help this boy for balance, not justice. In dreams, she and Hermes whispered advice to Perseus. They provided him with tools, a mirror-like shield, an adamantine sword, winged sandals for flying, and the helm of Hades to disappear from view. However, every gift had a purpose. In addition to killing a monster, Perseus was selected to finish a myth that started with a maiden praying to unheeding gods alone in a temple rather than with him. With the burden of a king's challenge on his shoulders and divine equipment by his side, Perseus started forth. However, locating Medusa was more complicated than just traveling by land or sea. Even the gods who had cursed her were unaware of her location, which had been buried by time. Perseus needed answers that no mortal could provide in order to locate her. He went in search of the grey, 3 old sisters who had 1 tooth and 1 eye in common. They lived in the space between nightmare and light, older than gods, and covered with resentment and darkness. Since they were related to Medusa, they knew where she slept. Perseus did not plead, he didn't beg. He waited for one of the sisters to pass the eye to the other before grabbing it out of their grasp. Holding their sole eyesight captive, he demanded, "Tell me, or stay blind forever." They spoke, but they hissed. They told him about an island far away, beyond mortal maps, where stone sculptures littered the shores like fallen soldiers, and where crags tore ships to splinters. A place where no stars dared to dwell, and no birds sang. Medusa's lair. With his sandals cutting through the clouds, Perseus took off, his pulse racing with anticipation rather than fear. With his head in his hands, he pictured himself making his way back to Seriphos, triumphant, Danae proud, and Polydectes humbled. He had been told a story, and he had not yet questioned it. It was a monster Medusa, that she was deserving of death. Though they had not forewarned him, the gods had prepared him. They hadn't mentioned that the corpses of guys who referred to themselves as heroes were scattered throughout the cave. Her eyes were cursed, but they hadn't stated they weren't harsh, and they hadn't mentioned that her face still retained the features of a once faithful woman beneath the myth's serpents. The winds howled louder as he soared across the water, as though they were trying to communicate. Perseus, however, heard nothing. The gods were familiar with the silence, because the last thing you want is for someone to hear your monster talk. The world appeared to hold its breath when Perseus touched down on the island's shores. There was no wind or sound of birds, only hundreds of sculptures strewn across the crags and cliffs like fallen warriors. Their eyes were wide with the last thing they ever saw, their faces contorted in fear, and their mouths frozen in mid-scream. She, with his mirrored shield tightly gripped and his sword sheathed, he strode across broken shields and stone limbs. He had been warned by Athena to avoid direct eye contact, employ reflection, move quickly, and keep quiet. However, the goddess had not explained why the sculptures appeared not only frightened, but also shocked, as though they had suddenly discovered their mistake. With his wings folded behind him, Perseus advanced farther into the cavern. Damp moss, snake smell, and something more filled the air. Sadness. Before he spotted her, the serpents hissed in a low symphony of fatigue and caution. And then she was there, not roaring, not charging, not even conscious. Coiled on a bed of stone, Medusa slept with her arms wrapped around her like a child. In the mirrored shield, her face looked serene and delicate. Though her features were partially obscured by the tangle of poisonous serpents that were currently sleeping, there was a unique beauty that persisted. She didn't appear to be a monster. She had the appearance of someone who had been abandoned. Perseus paused. This was not the terrifying creature depicted on urns and shields, nor was it the howling beast that was the subject of stories. She was simply a woman, sleeping, cursed, and completely alone. But he had been given a duty by the gods. He thought of his mum. He recalled Polydectes' derisive voice. Glory, he recalled. With his gaze focused on the reflected shield, he raised the blade. He moved closer. A snake raised its head. With her eyes still closed, Medusa stirred. She didn't yell. She didn't struggle. Her breath came in short gasps, and Perseus struck at that very time. With a divine edge, the blade hissed through the air. Then there was silence. The island let out a breath when her head landed in the bronze-scaled satchel. The curse was lifted, or so he believed, because a tail cannot be killed, but a body can. And the tale of Medusa was only getting started. Perseus left without lingering. He climbed into the sky, shoes thumping the clouds, Medusa's head locked in the magical bag, its stare still powerful even in death. But the island's solitude held on to him. Not a triumphant silence, something colder. Quiet power still pulsed through the head. It was cut, but not dead. Sensing the environment outside the sack, the snakes writhed and flicked their tongues. She kept her eyes open, unblinking, and able to frighten anyone who ventured to look inside. Then Perseus looked away. He was afraid. He now had a weapon from the gods, a heavenly trump card. But carrying it made him uncomfortable. Creatures of shadows swirled in the waves as he flew across the ocean, for this deed had roused ancient pacts, even though it was heroic in the mortal world. The passing of Medusa had not gone ignored. Her murderer had upset the equilibrium deep in the sea. Poseidon sensed it. Athena was aware of it. Silently, the fates weaved, and a storm started to build up far above Olympus. Perseus persisted anyway. His mind was focused on what would happen next. He was going back to Seriphus. He would rescue his mother, restore his name, and silence King Polydectes. He would be a hero. That was the promise of the stories. However, the satchel's weight conveyed a different message. He recalled the face he had seen and the mirrored shield. She hadn't growled. She hadn't made a lunge. She had been asleep. Was that a monster, really? Alternatively, had he killed a misunderstood warning? He ignored the concept. Had he not been led by the gods? However, Perseus sensed something strange when the wind howled louder. It was a buzzing head. It was a sensation rather than a sound, as though it could still recall the world, as though Medusa's disfigured, cursed, and betrayed soul was still aware, waiting and looking outward. Perseus would never sleep comfortably again, even though he would go on to kill monsters, save maidens, and etch his name in the heavens, because he occasionally claimed to have heard the faint rattling of snakes beneath his bedroll at night. Occasionally, he would dream about a girl kneeling in a temple, pleading with the gods to keep her safe rather than victory. With the head of a legend hidden beneath his cloak, wind-blown hair, and celestial armor, Perseus made his way back to Seriphus. Unaware of what was inside the satchel or how much it had cost, the crowd cheered him on. King Polydectes, however, was not a fool. He didn't think the boy would live. His challenge had been a mocking death sentence. The king's sneer swiftly changed to uneasiness as Perseus strolled into the palace with his head held high. "Did you bring me a present?" Polydectes made fun of it while attempting to maintain control. Perseus gave one nod. "A sign of your request." He opened the knapsack after saying that. Polydectes looked into Medusa's eyes for a moment. Only a moment. It was sufficient. Stone broke like ice on glass through his skin. His eyes widened, his lips turned to granite, trapping his last breath. So conceited and brutal, the king was reduced to a statue. Screams broke out in the room. Courtiers ran away. A few dropped on their knees. Perseus said nothing, his face unreadable. Danae, his mother, hurried to give him a hug. Free at last. Perseus remained silent about the girl in the cave. They saw Medusa as a vanquished monster. A tool was employed, a challenge surmounted. Nobody inquired about her identity. Perseus, however, recalled her body's descent, the way her expression begged rather than growled in the mirror. Nevertheless, the tale gained rapid traction. They sang songs, temples went up. Gorgon's Slayer was Perseus's nickname, the god's champion, Cursebreaker. They carved his name into the marble, but they never carved hers next to it. Athena herself had commanded him to mount Medusa's head on her shield in his old years. Once derided, her features has been transformed into a tool of heavenly justice. But not fairness to her, fairness to others. Medusa served even after death. Her power persisted even in silence, and for years to come, the golden hero Perseus strode under that shield. He used the face of the woman he had killed to celebrate each win. They loved him. They were afraid of her. Furthermore, neither could alter the roles that the gods had assigned them. In addition to praising Perseus for his victory, Athena called him to Olympus to reclaim what had always been hers. Not the headpiece of Hades, not the sandals, not the sword. She desired the head, Medusa's head. Without asking, Perseus offered the satchel in compliance. Athena transformed the head of her former priestess into a legendary weapon by skillfully attaching it to her shield, or aegis. From the bronze curve of the goddess's arm, the Gorgon's face, once bright and innocent, now snarled in frozen hatred. War ensued wherever Athena marched. When they saw it, enemies froze in place. Cities collapsed. Aegis statues were found on coins and at temples. Her shield turned into a banner and a warning. However, nobody ever inquired as to why Medusa had initially been cursed. The goddess of knowledge, Athena, once wore the face of a woman she had chastised, not as a reminder of what happens when mortals go too far, nor out of remorse, but rather as a representation of divine power. Some, however, muttered in a different way. According to some, Athena was giving Medusa immortality rather than returning a weapon. She made sure Medusa would never be forgotten by putting her on the aegis, that even the gods had to bear the repercussions of their deeds, and that the girl who had once sobbed in her temple was now engraved into forever. However, the truth was coated in absurdity, as is always the case with gods. Medusa now held that same humiliation in her possession, like a trophy after Athena had chastised her for defaming her temple. The change was finished. After serving as a priestess, Medusa became a victim, a monster, a weapon, and finally, an emblem. But something was still alive, something the world couldn't ignore, somewhere in the terrible slant of her terrified eyes, somewhere in the curve of that chiseled jaw, because a small percentage of people always looked at her face and didn't see a monster, even while she was turning armies to stone. They witnessed a protest, a warning, and a question. Power that no sword could equal. Now Medusa's face gazed eternally and without blinking out from Athena's aegis. For the majority, it represented divine fear, adversaries turned to stone, and victories gained with a single look. However, others who peered more closely saw that glare was filled with more than just rage. It had memories. It was unfair. No temple scroll ever dared to write the truth that was contained in it. Warriors marched behind the shield for generations, not realizing that the visage they carried was originally that of a woman who had never used violence. Her curse, bestowed by the gods, had turned into an instrument of power. Her trauma had been fully weaponized. She could still see with her eyes. Her eyes witnessed 1,000 wars long after her voice had been muted. She saw kings come and go. She seen heroes become ruthless and temples fall apart. She witnessed ladies who understood what she had lost, whispering prayers and altars being raised to those who had declared her a monster. These women also occasionally left offerings. Little clay snakes positioned at secret shrines, a cloth-wrapped hair, a name muttered in the shadows, not out of fear, but in remembering, because Medusa had been a guardian long before she became a cautionary tale. Yes, her cave had turned into a cemetery for would-be conquerors, but it was also a haven where no man could go and live, where the hunted were rendered untouchable. Her legend eventually fell apart. She continued to be the Gorgon to some, but to others she took on a completely different form, becoming a goddess of fury and injured justice, a spirit that stood between the weak and the predators, or a sign of resistance. Like all mythologies, hers grew and changed, but at its core it stayed the same. A lady whose tale had been stolen, a woman whose gaze could never be removed, a woman mistreated, a woman changed by suffering. Thus she continued to look at shields, paintings, sculptures, coins and dreams, and every time it was recounted someone would pause and wonder if she was the monster after all. And Medusa came back to life in that query. Empires fell apart and new gods emerged and vanished over the centuries, but Medusa remained, not as physical flesh and blood, but as a shadow and a symbol. Her visage travelled through cultures, appearing in Byzantium, Rome, and other remote regions of the world after being carved into marble and cast in bronze. Just below the surface of memory and myth, her image persisted. But over time, an odd thing occurred. The story broke apart. In one version, she continued to be the Gorgon, the snake-haired murderer who, with a gaze, turned men to stone. Mounted atop gates, doors, and armor, her head became a talisman against evil, in the hopes that her legend would frighten people more than any spear. Soldiers brought her into battle. But beside it, a different story silently developed, one that was whispered by women, philosophers, and poets, whose voices were rarely recorded in scrolls. In this tale, Medusa was a wronged woman who was cursed for a transgression against her and punished for her beauty, rather than a beast to be killed. This variant whispered rather than roared. It questioned why the god of the sea would go unpunished, why a goddess of knowledge would punish her own servant, and why so many men wanted to kill her when all she wanted was to be left alone. These queries grew like plants in marble crevices in bars, libraries, and obscure areas of temples, and gradually Medusa's image started to change once more. She turned into a mirror of truth rather than fear. Women started to identify with her as victims of silence, survivors of assault, and souls compelled to bear the moniker of monster just for being frightened. Her snakes were now a crown rather than a punishment. Her eyes were a defense honed by treachery, not a curse. Medusa resurrects in contemporary stories and artwork, this time to testify rather than to frighten. She gazes with sorrow and rage at paintings, because tales change, and sometimes the monster is the one with the sword rather than the fangs. Her story is replayed not to exalt Perseus, but to query why he was referred to as a hero at all. And Medusa blinks once and observes the beginning of understanding in each generation that dared to challenge the traditional tale.